to strange epochs. I'm Shawn Spainhour, and this is the show where we take one strange, true, documented moment from somewhere in the long and bewildering span of human history, and we sit with it. New episodes every Tuesday. Sources are always in the episode description. This week we are going to Portugal, the 16th century, a small walled town called Trancoso in the Portuguese interior, where a shoemaker is writing poetry. Not ordinary poetry. Prophecy. Dark, specific, rolling verses about a hidden king who will come from the fog to restore Portugal to greatness, a king who will conquer Africa, reunite Christendom, and usher in an age of universal peace and divine justice. The shoemaker's name is Gonçalo Anes Bandara, and his verses will be banned by the Inquisition, circulated illegally in handwritten copies, and read with desperate attention for the next 4 centuries. His poems will be cited to explain a king's disastrous decision to march into Morocco with an army he could not afford and a crusading ambition he could not restrain. They will be used to comfort a nation that loses its king, its independence, and 60 years of its sovereignty in a single afternoon in August of 1578. They will inspire a messianic cult that will produce false kings, genuine rebellions, and a national mythology so powerful that the greatest Portuguese poet of the 20th century will build his masterwork around it. And the king, at the center of it all, Sebastian I of Portugal, 24 years old, who rode into battle against the advice of everyone who loved him, who led 8,000 men to their deaths in the African desert, whose body was never conclusively identified, will be expected back on a foggy morning, riding in from the sea for the next 400 years. He has not come back yet, but Portugal is still waiting. Let's begin. The plains of Morocco, August 4th, 1578, a Wednesday afternoon. The battle is already lost, and King Sebastian of Portugal does not know it yet. Or perhaps he does know it, perhaps in the final minutes of the engagement, as the Moroccan cavalry rolls through the flanks of the Portuguese formation, and the river cuts off retreat, and the screaming and the dust and the heat of an African August close in from every direction. There is a moment of clarity for a young king who has been told his entire life that he is destined for greatness. Sebastian is 24 years old. He has been king since he was 3, when his grandfather died and left a country to an infant. He has been educated by Jesuits in the specific idiom of Portuguese imperial piety, raised to believe that Portugal's destiny was divinely ordained, that the crusading mission of the nation was real and holy and waiting to be fulfilled. He has read the prophecies. He knows what the shoemaker of Trancoso wrote about the hidden king who would conquer Africa and establish the 5th empire of the world. He believes those prophecies are about him. He has marched 14,000 men, Portuguese soldiers, Spanish volunteers, Moroccan allies, mercenaries from across Europe, deep into the African interior in August, the worst possible time for a European army. He has ignored the advice of his commanders, who told him the position was untenable. He has ignored the advice of Philip II of Spain, who sent letters warning against the campaign. He has ignored the advice of the Pope. He has pressed inland into the heat toward the waiting army of the Saadian Sultan, because he is the hidden king, and the hidden king does not retreat. The Moroccan army outnumbers him. The Moroccan cavalry is better. The Portuguese position is flanked by a river on one side, an open plain on the other. By the time Sebastian understands that the battle is a catastrophe, there is nowhere to go. He rides into the fighting. He is not seen again. The Battle of Alcácer Quibir takes perhaps 3 hours. When it is over, approximately 8,000 men are dead, and most of the rest are prisoners. The flower of Portuguese nobility has been destroyed in an afternoon. The king's body is not found, or rather a body is identified as Sebastian's and eventually ransomed from the Moroccans and returned to Portugal for burial. But the identification is contested. The body is damaged. People who knew Sebastian say it does not look like him, and the people of Portugal, who are about to lose their independence to Spain, who are about to watch 60 years of their national sovereignty absorbed into a foreign empire, those people are not ready to believe that Sebastian is dead. The numbers in the days after the battle arrived slowly to Lisbon. 8,000 dead, the rest prisoners. The commander of the Portuguese forces, the dukes and counts and marquesses who had led their men into Morocco dead or captive. The treasury, already strained by the cost of assembling the army, now faces the additional drain of ransoming those who survived and can be ransomed. And the king no confirmed report, a body that might be his, witnesses who are not certain. The gap in the information is wide enough to drive a hope through. He is not dead. He is the encoberto, the hidden king. He is waiting in the fog, somewhere, until the moment is right. The shoemaker of Trancoso said he would return. He will return. He will come back on a foggy morning, riding from the sea. Gonzalo Anes Bandara was born in Trancoso, a small walled town in the Portuguese interior, around 1500. He was a shoemaker, a craftsman, a working man, not a monk or a theologian or a man of letters in any formal sense. What he was a poet, and not only a poet, a seer, in his own understanding, and in the understanding of the people who gathered to hear his verses recited in the marketplace, and the tavern, and the church square of Trancoso in the 1530s. To understand why a shoemaker's verses could become this powerful, you have to understand the specific mythology that Portugal had been building about itself since its founding in the 12th century. Portugal was not just a country. It was, in its own self-understanding, an elect nation. The founding story held that King Afonso Henriques, the first king of Portugal, had received a divine vision before the Battle of Alcácer in 1139, in which Christ appeared to him and promised that Portugal would spread the Christian faith to the ends of the earth. Whether the vision was real or invented, the story was treated as foundational. Portugal's identity was bound up from the very beginning with the idea that it had a special mission in sacred history. The age of exploration, Vasco da Gama, Magellan, Cabral, seemed to fulfill that mission. Portugal had indeed reached the ends of the earth. It had built an empire that spanned 4 continents. It was, for a brief and extraordinary moment, in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, the most powerful maritime nation in the world. The prophecy had come true. And then, slowly and then very fast, it began to come undone. The empire was expensive to maintain and difficult to defend. Competition from other European powers, Spain, England, the Netherlands, was eroding Portugal's commercial dominance. The country's population was small relative to the empire it was trying to hold. The succession crisis that produced Sebastian was itself a symptom of the underlying fragility. There were not enough of these heirs, and the ones that existed were young and untested and carrying the weight of a national mythology that was becoming harder to sustain in the face of ordinary historical reality. Into this mounting anxiety, the Trovas of Bandara offered a promise. The story was not over. The divine election was real. The hidden king was coming. His poems were called trovas, from the Portuguese word for verses, but specifically verses with a prophetic or mystical character. The trovas of Bandeira were dense, elusive, deliberately obscure in the manner of all good prophecy, specific enough to seem to refer to real events, vague enough to be applied to almost any situation by a sufficiently motivated reader. They drew on the Old Testament, on astrological imagery, on the Portuguese messianic tradition that had been building since the nation's founding, and on Bandeira's own remarkable capacity for combining all of these elements into verses that felt true in the way that dreams feel true, not literally, but essentially. The central figure of the trovas was the Rei Encoberto, the hidden king, a monarch who would emerge from obscurity or from death or from some liminal state between the two, who would lead Portugal to the completion of its divine mission, who would conquer the Turks and the Moors, who would be crowned emperor in Jerusalem, who would preside over the conversion of all nations to the one true faith and the inauguration of a fifth empire of the world, a universal Christian monarchy that would fulfill the prophecy of Daniel and bring history to its glorious conclusion. This vision was not unique to Bandeira. The idea of a coming universal monarch who would complete the Christian mission had been circulating in European and Portuguese religious culture for centuries, drawing on the Book of Daniel, on the Revelation of John, on Arthurian legend, on the specific mythology of the Portuguese founding that held the nation to be divinely elected for a special role in sacred history. What Bandeira did was give this tradition popular, vernacular, emotionally immediate expression. He gave it a voice that a shoemaker's customers could recognize and repeat. He democratized the messianic vision. His audience was, from the beginning, mixed in ways that would eventually make him dangerous to the authorities. He was read by old Christians, the established Catholic population of Portugal, and by new Christians, the conversos, Jews who had been forced to convert to Christianity in 1497, when King Manuel I had ordered the entire Jewish population of Portugal to accept baptism or leave the country. The new Christians occupied a precarious social position. They were officially Christian but were regarded with suspicion by the Inquisition, which believed, with some reason, that many of them practiced Judaism privately. They were formally equal to old Christians but were socially and legally disadvantaged in ways that made their integration incomplete and their loyalties questioned. This convergence of audiences around Bandeira's verses is one of the most interesting things about them. Old Christians reading a promise of national greatness. New Christians reading a promise of justice and inclusion. Each group finding in the same verses what they needed to find. This is the specific genius of good prophecy. It is porous enough to absorb the projections of whoever reads it, specific enough to feel like it is speaking directly to their situation, and ambiguous enough to survive the disappointments that any literal reading would eventually encounter. Bandeira wrote verses about a hidden king who would restore Portugal to greatness. In 1530, that meant something. In 1580, when Portugal had lost its independence, it meant something different. In 1640, when independence was restored, it meant something different again. In 1897, when Brazilian millenarians were dying at Canudos, it meant something different still. The verses were flexible. The hope was persistent. The trovas appealed to new Christians for specific reasons. Bandeira's vision of the hidden king included, in some readings, the ingathering of the lost tribes of Israel, a messianic theme with deep resonance for a population that retained Jewish cultural memory, even under a Christian surface. The vision of a coming age of universal justice and the end of discrimination had obvious appeal for a community that was living under systematic discrimination. Whether Bandara himself was of Jewish origin is a question that has never been fully settled. But his verses were read as speaking to the new Christian experience in ways that the Inquisition found suspicious. The Inquisition came for Bandera in 1541. He was brought before the tribunal on a charge that amounted to unauthorized prophesying and excessive familiarity with biblical interpretation for a man of his station. The shoemaker was not supposed to be interpreting scripture. The church had experts for that. Bandera's crime was not heresy, exactly, but something more unsettling. He had made the prophetic tradition available to people who were not authorized to access it, and he had done so in a form that was dangerously easy to understand and to spread. He was found not guilty of the heresy charge, but was required to participate in an auto de fe procession, the public ritual of penance and humiliation that the Inquisition used to demonstrate its authority and reinforce boundaries of acceptable belief, and was forbidden to write or interpret scripture further. He returned to Trancoso and died there in 1556, apparently having kept his promise to the Inquisition and having stopped writing. The Inquisition's handling of Bandara is itself revealing. They could not condemn him for heresy because his beliefs, taken individually, were not clearly heretical. He believed in the Old Testament. He believed in the coming of a divinely appointed king. He interpreted prophetic scripture in ways that were unusual but not definitively contrary to Catholic doctrine. What they could do, and what they did, was impose silence. He was told to stop writing, stop interpreting, stop performing his verses in public. The Inquisition's concern was not primarily theological. It was social. A shoemaker who could make prophecy feel immediate and personal to ordinary people, who could give the messianic tradition a popular voice that circulated in marketplaces rather than in monasteries, that was a threat to the church's control of the interpretive tradition, regardless of whether his specific doctrines were heretical. They silenced the man. They could not silence the verses. His verses did not stop circulating. The trovas spread through Portugal in handwritten copies, passed from hand to hand, read in secret, quoted in letters, incorporated into sermons. They were added to the Index of Forbidden Books, the Inquisition's catalog of prohibited texts, which had approximately the effect you would expect from trying to suppress something that people had already memorized and hidden in their hearts. The prohibition made them more valuable, not less. The shoemaker of Trancoso had been silenced by the Inquisition. His words had not. Sebastian I of Portugal was born in January of 1554, 2 weeks after the death of his father, and became king at the age of 3 when his grandfather John III died in 1557. He was the last of the Aviz dynasty, a line that had ruled Portugal since 1385 and had presided over the extraordinary century of Portuguese expansion that had built an empire stretching from Brazil to India to the Spice Islands of Southeast Asia. He was, in other words, the heir to one of the most consequential national stories in the history of early modern Europe. And he carried that inheritance with the specific weight of a young man who has been told from childhood that the weight is sacred. He was educated almost entirely by Jesuits, who gave him a piety that shaded into obsession and a crusading idealism that his advisors found frightening even as they were unable to moderate it. He was unmarried, refused all proposed matches, apparently celibate, apparently uninterested in producing an heir, despite the obvious succession crisis this created. His physical health was uncertain. His mental stability was questioned. quietly, by people around him who saw the intensity of his religious conviction as something other than ordinary devotion. He fasted. He prayed for hours. He drilled his soldiers personally, with an enthusiasm that went beyond the king's traditional role as supreme commander. He was preparing for something. What he was preparing for was the crusade. Morocco had been a theater of Portuguese military activity since the 15th century. Portugal held several garrison cities on the Moroccan coast, Ceuta, Tangier, Mazagan, and the coast itself was a complex zone of political and military competition. When a deposed Moroccan sultan named Abu Abdallah Muhammad II came to Sebastian in 1577, offering Portuguese military support in exchange for help reclaiming his throne, Sebastian saw his opportunity. This was the African Crusade. This was the campaign the prophecies had promised. This was the moment when the hidden king would reveal himself. The campaign was catastrophically ill-conceived from the beginning, and people who knew what they were talking about said so. Philip II of Spain, Sebastian's uncle, the most powerful monarch in Europe, a man with considerable experience of African military campaigning, sent multiple messages warning against it. Sebastian's own commanders were uneasy. The logistics were inadequate. The army assembled from Portugal's own forces, Spanish and Italian volunteers, and various mercenaries, was too small and too expensive for what Sebastian was proposing to do with it. The timing was wrong. The season was wrong. August in Morocco is brutally hot, and European armies and heavy equipment could not sustain a campaign in that heat. Sebastian crossed to Morocco in the summer of 1578 and marched inland. He was following the prophetic script. The hidden king does not turn back. The hidden king advances into the territory that God has destined for him. The Portuguese army that crossed to Morocco in 1578 was, by the standards of the time, reasonably well equipped, but clearly inadequate for what Sebastian intended to do with it. It numbered somewhere between 15 and 20,000 men in total, of whom about 8,000 were Portuguese regulars, and the rest, Spanish volunteers, papal contingents, Italian mercenaries, and the forces of Abu Abdallah, the deposed Moroccan sultan whose cause Sebastian had taken up. They brought with them artillery, cavalry, and the specific logistical nightmare of a European army trying to campaign in North African summer heat, which required quantities of water that the terrain could not reliably supply and a pace of march that the soldiers could not sustain without significant casualties from heat stroke and dehydration before a battle had even been fought. Sebastian's commanders knew all of this. They told him. He pressed inland anyway. The Saadian Sultan Abd al-Malik, who was defending his throne against Abu Abdallah's challenge, had a larger army and knew the terrain. He placed his forces at Alcácer Quibir, Ksar el-Kabir in Arabic, the great castle where the Wadi al-Makazin River created a natural obstacle on one side of the battlefield. On August 4th, 1578, the armies met. The battle lasted several hours and went badly wrong for the Portuguese almost immediately. The terrain that Sebastian had accepted with the river at his back, restricting retreat, became a trap. The Moroccan cavalry worked around the flanks. The Portuguese infantry, exhausted from the march and struggling in the heat, could not hold its formations. The allied Moroccan forces under Abu Abdallah collapsed early in the fighting. Sebastian led personal charges into the battle with a recklessness that his officers could not restrain. 3 kings died that day at Alcácer Quibir, which is why the battle is sometimes called the Battle of the Three Kings. Abd al-Malik, the defending sultan, was already dying of illness when the battle began and died in its early stages, replaced on the field by his brother, Abu Abdallah, Sebastian's ally, drowned in the river during the rout, and Sebastian disappeared. Not confirmed killed, not seen to fall, not identified, among the dead at the time. A body was eventually identified as Sebastian's, ransomed from the Moroccans, and returned to Portugal for burial. But the identification was disputed from the beginning. The body had been exposed in the African heat for several days before its recovery and was in poor condition. Witnesses who had known Sebastian personally expressed doubt. The gap between what was known and what could be verified was exactly the gap that the messianic imagination needed. The political consequences were immediate and devastating. Sebastian had no children. With his death or disappearance, the Aviz dynasty ended. The succession passed to Philip II of Spain, who had the strongest legal claim to the Portuguese throne and the military power to enforce it. In 1580, 2 years after Alcácer Quibir, Portugal was absorbed into the Iberian Union. The same Philip II, whose warnings Sebastian had ignored, was now king of Portugal. The empire that Portugal had spent a century building was now administered from Madrid. The country that had launched Vasco da Gama and Magellan, that had built the first global maritime empire, that believed itself divinely chosen for a special role in sacred history, that country was now a province of its neighbor. Bandera had prophesied the hidden king. The hidden king had ridden into the desert and not come back. The prophecy had to be reinterpreted. It had to be that Sebastian was not dead. It had to be that the defeat at Alcácer Quibir was not the end of the story, but a test, a preparation, a necessary darkness before the dawn that the shoemaker's verses had promised. The question of Sebastian's body is not a trivial detail. In the culture of 16th century European Catholicism, the identification of a king's body was a significant political act. It certified the death. It closed the succession. It removed the ambiguity that pretenders could exploit. The inability to produce a conclusively identified body was not just a logistical problem, it was a political vulnerability that the Sebastianist tradition would exploit for decades. Philip II, who had the strongest interest in Sebastian being unambiguously dead, did everything he could to establish the identification of the recovered body. Critics argued that the identification was politically motivated. The Portuguese, who wanted their king to still be alive, found it easy to believe that a Spanish king would lie about such a thing. The uncertainty was real enough to sustain the myth, and the myth was too useful to those who sustained it to be easily corrected. And so, Sebastianism was born. The belief that Sebastian would return, that he was not dead, that he was waiting in some hidden place, that he would emerge on a foggy morning, riding from the sea, to reclaim his throne and restore Portugal to greatness, spread through the Portuguese population with a speed and a depth that surprised the authorities and has never entirely surprised anyone who understands what the Portuguese had lost. They had lost their king. They had lost their independence. They had lost, in a single afternoon in August, the flower of their nobility, the men who had commanded the armies and administered the empire and formed the social and political fabric of the country. Many of those men were taken prisoner and ransomed over the following years, or died in Moroccan captivity, or never returned. The survivors came home to a country that was no longer fully its own, administered by Spanish viceroys under a king who sat in Madrid and had warned Sebastian against the very campaign that had destroyed him. The specific losses at Alcácer Quibir were not only numerical, they were generational. The battle killed or captured most of the men who had been running Portugal's empire and its administrative apparatus. The ransoming of prisoners drained the treasury. Families were impoverished, paying for the return of their fathers and sons and brothers. The noble families that had provided the officer class for the Portuguese army, the governors for the overseas territories, the administrators for the court and the church and the imperial bureaucracy, those families had sent their men to Morocco and received back a fraction of them, damaged and depleted over the following years. Philip II's takeover of the Portuguese throne in 1580 met resistance from some quarters, but compliance from others, partly because the country simply did not have enough capable men left to mount an effective, sustained opposition. Sebastian had not merely lost a battle, he had decapitated his country. Into this situation, the prophecies of the shoemaker of Trancoso offered something that no political argument could provide: hope of a specifically Portuguese kind. Not hope that circumstances might improve, or that a new king might do better, or that the Spanish administration might be reasonably benign. Hope that the story was not over, that the defeat was not final, that somewhere in the fog there was a king who had not abandoned his people, who was waiting for the right moment, who would come back. This hope expressed itself in a number of ways that ranged from the entirely peaceful to the violently rebellious. The most peaceful expressions were literary and theological. The Jesuit priest Antonio Vieira, one of the most remarkable figures in 17th century Portuguese and Brazilian culture, a gifted orator and theologian who spent decades in Brazil defending the rights of indigenous people against colonial exploitation, became the most sophisticated interpreter of the Sebastianist tradition. Vieira read Bandeira through the lens of the prophet Daniel and the Book of Revelation, and produced an elaborate theological system that placed Portugal at the center of sacred history and promised the coming fifth empire of the world, a universal Christian monarchy that would be led by a resurrected or returned Portuguese king and would bring history to its culmination. Vieira's version of the prophecy was more sophisticated than Bandeira's verses and more dangerous in its implications because it gave the Sebastianist hope, intellectual respectability that the Inquisition could not easily dismiss. The Inquisition imprisoned him anyway. Vieira's trajectory is worth noting in more detail because he is one of the most extraordinary figures produced by the Sebastianist tradition. He was born in Lisbon in 1608, moved to Brazil as a child, became a Jesuit, and spent decades in the Brazilian interior defending indigenous people against enslavement by the colonial settlers, a cause for which he made powerful enemies and was eventually expelled from Brazil. Back in Portugal, he produced a series of sermons and theological writings that placed the Sebastianist prophecy at the center of a grand historical theory. Portugal was the nation chosen by God to build the Fifth Empire, a universal monarchy that would bring all peoples under the rule of Christ and mark the end of history as a period of tribulation. The Portuguese king who would lead this empire was coming. The defeat at Alcácer Quibir was not the failure of the prophecy, but its preparation. Sebastian would return, or someone in Sebastian's line would fulfill the role. The Inquisition imprisoned Vieira twice for his ideas. He outlived both imprisonments and died at the age of 89, still convinced that the Fifth Empire was coming. The more violent expressions took the form of false Sebastians, men who claimed to be the king himself, returned from Morocco to reclaim his throne. There were at least 4 significant pretenders between 1580 and 1600, each of whom attracted followers, each of whom was eventually captured and executed by the Spanish authorities, and each of whose execution produced not the closure the authorities desired, but a further intensification of the belief. If this Sebastian was false, the real one was still out there. The logic of the hidden king was impervious to disproof. The most notable of the false Sebastians was a pastry cook from Madrigal de las Altas Torres, a town in Spain, who claimed to be the missing king in 1594. His claim was supported by a Portuguese Augustinian friar named Miguel dos Santos and by a niece of Philip II named Anna de Austria, who was a nun and who apparently believed the pretender's claim or found it politically useful. The pastry cook was executed in 1595. The friar was executed. Anna de Austria was punished. The execution produced the usual result, not the end of Sebastianism, but its continuation. Portugal regained its independence from Spain in 1640. The restoration was the result of a coup by Portuguese nobles in December of 1640, which placed John IV of the House of Braganza on the Portuguese throne. It was, for the Sebastianists, a complicated moment. They wanted Sebastian, not another king. Some of them accommodated John IV within the prophetic framework by arguing that he was a precursor to Sebastian's return, rather than the final fulfillment of the prophecy. John IV himself, according to some accounts, swore to yield his throne to Sebastian if Sebastian appeared, which was perhaps the most pragmatic possible response to a messianic cult that had been driving Portuguese political life for 60 years. The influence of Sebastianism extended far beyond Portugal's borders. The Portuguese had established an enormous empire, and wherever they went, they brought Bandara's prophecies and the cult of the hidden king with them. In Brazil, Sebastianism merged with indigenous and African religious traditions to produce syncretic movements that were explicitly Sebastianist in their framing. The most remarkable of these was the Canudos movement in the northeast of Brazil in the 1890s, when a charismatic religious leader named Antonio Conselheiro established a millenarian community of tens of thousands of followers in the backlands of Bahia. The Brazilian Republic's government eventually sent 4 military expeditions against Canudos, the last of which destroyed the settlement in 1897. Conselheiro died during the siege. The Brazilian writer Euclides de Cunha documented the conflict in a book called Os Sertões Rebellion in the Backlands, which is considered one of the masterworks of Brazilian literature and which situates the Canudos community within the long arc of the Sebastianist tradition. The concept of saudade is worth dwelling on because it is the emotional key to understanding why Sebastianism lasted as long as it did. Saudade is a Portuguese word with no precise English equivalent. It has been translated as longing, as melancholy, as nostalgia, as the ache of absence, but none of these translations captures its full range. It is not simply sadness. It is a kind of active yearning for something that was real and is gone, or that was possible and was not achieved, or that is loved and is absent. It carries within it both the pain of loss and the persistence of love for the lost thing. It is, in some formulations, the defining characteristic of the Portuguese soul, a people who built a great empire and lost it, who knew a moment of extraordinary power and influence and then watched it slip away, who have been living with that gap between what was and what might have been ever since. In Portugal itself, the tradition culminated, in literary terms, in the work of Fernando Pessoa, the greatest Portuguese poet of the 20th century, a man of extraordinary sophistication and radical ambiguity, who nonetheless chose the Sebastianist myth as the framework for his only major work in Portuguese, the poetry collection Mensagem, published in 1934. Pessoa's Sebastianism was not simple nostalgia for a vanished king. It was a meditation on the Portuguese soul, on the specific quality of longing and expectation that the Portuguese call saudade, a word with no precise English equivalent, something between nostalgia and yearning, and the specific ache of something beloved and absent. Pessoa saw in the story of Sebastian and the hidden king an emblem of something essential about the Portuguese experience, the sense of a greatness that was real, that was achieved, and that was lost, and the faith that it would return. The word he coined for this condition was Sebastianismo, a 4-century-long waiting for a king who rode into the African desert and did not come home. The fog motif, Sebastian returning on a foggy morning, is perhaps the most specifically Portuguese element of the entire Sebastianist tradition. The Atlantic fog is a real and frequent presence on the Portuguese coast. It comes in off the sea in the early hours, dense and cold, obscuring the horizon, making the familiar landscape strange. To the Portuguese imagination, this fog has always been associated with the edge of the known world. It is where the great ships disappeared on their voyages of discovery, where the known gave way to the unknown, where anything was possible, including return. Sebastian, who disappeared into the African desert and was swallowed by the heat and the dust and the unresolvable ambiguity of an unidentified body, would come back through the opposite element, the cool, gray, Atlantic fog of home. The return would be from the water, not the land. The hidden thing would emerge from the obscuring medium, suddenly visible, suddenly present. It is an image that has an extraordinary grip on the imagination, which is probably why it has survived for 400 years unchanged. Gonçalo Anes Bandada, the shoemaker of Trancoso, died in 1556, 22 years before the battle, whose aftermath his verses would explain and shape. He never knew that his poems would outlive him by centuries, would be carried to Brazil by Portuguese colonists, would inspire religious communities and political rebellions, and one of the masterworks of 20th century poetry. He never knew that the king his prophecies described would disappear in the African desert in exactly the circumstances that his verses, read with sufficient creativity, could be made to predict. He was a shoemaker who wrote verses that people needed to believe in a country that needed something to believe, and the specific form that belief took the hidden king in the fog, waiting to return, turned out to be one of the most durable messianic myths in Western history. There is a house in Trancoso today called the House of Bandara. Visitors can hear his ballads recited at the bottom of a well in the courtyard. They can see reproductions of the trovas and reenactments of his Inquisition trial. They can walk the streets of the small walled city where the shoemaker sat at his bench and wrote verses about a king who had not yet been born. Sebastian's tomb is in Lisbon, at the Jeronimos Monastery, where the great figures of the age of exploration are buried. Whether the body in it is actually his has never been proven beyond reasonable doubt. The fog comes in off the Atlantic every morning, the way it always has. And somewhere in it, if you believe the shoemaker, a king is still waiting to ride. That's what Strange Epochs is. Stories that have no clean endings. Moments that history recorded, but never quite explained. Events that happened, undeniably happened, and yet still somehow feel impossible. Everything you heard in this episode is real. Every name, every date, every detail drawn from documented historical sources. All of the sources for this episode are listed in the episode description below. I encourage you to look them up. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow Strange Epochs wherever you listen. New episodes drop every Tuesday. And if you want to help the show grow, leaving a review goes a long way. It really does. I'll see you next week. I'm Shawn Spainhour. This is Strange Epochs.